Well, welcome everybody. We are so pleased that you're here. If you're wondering what the session is, we are here for the second discussion of the day, building equity into teaching through contemplative practice with Dr. Roshmi Mishra from State University of New York, Oswego. And before I hand the reins to her, just have a couple of details. One, we have turned on the captions for you. So make sure that you go down to the closed caption button and choose show subtitle if you wish to. You can turn them on and off as you wish. We also encourage comments and questions via the chat. And so as we go through this today, we hope you'll share any ideas that this provokes for you, as well as make sure Dr. Mishra knows what questions you have for her. And then last but not least, this is being recorded for our colleagues who have other commitments, couldn't be here, but we know that people are already asking from yesterday, when will we have the recordings? So we will get those up as soon as possible, but we're here and it's time for discussion number 2. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Mishra.
Thank you so much. And I'm so delighted that you're here. I'm a college professor, so I love it when people just interrupt me and ask questions in the moment. Very serious. It's a very Socratic method of teaching, and I love that. So please, I encourage you to do that. Also, I'm not very good at multitasking, which means that when the chat box has something in it, I can't read it and still talk to people. You know, Zoom used to put the chat box on the side. Now it's something you have to click onto, and I'm just not good at that. So I'm not ignoring you if I don't address it. I really encourage you to just talk to me. So I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. And I'm under the impression that we all have some interest or some love for, see if I can get it, there we go, for understanding contemplative practices and understanding what is mindfulness and how it can be used in the educational setting. I am working with SUNY Oswego, which was where my home was. I have relocated to Florida, but I am still working with SUNY Oswego as an adjunct faculty. So I want to introduce, as we always do, like, why are we here? What's going on here? I just want to remind you that I'm really delighted to be here. I'm a university professor. I'm also a former secondary science teacher, teaching biology and chemistry in rural Title I schools in upstate New York, closer to Watertown, Syracuse, in Canada. I'm also a yoga and meditation teacher, and my approach is a form of trauma-sensitive approach, and I've done some training with nonviolent communication as well. And this informs not just the way I teach yoga and meditation, but it also informs the way that I move about and speak in my classes. So I want to present the use of mindfulness, and we're going to call it a vector. And that's what I'm saying, is that I am embodying this practice, and then I bring this practice into everything that I do. Doesn't mean I'm perfect. And I often tell people, you know, yoga teachers also have problems. They also have temper tantrums. They also have issues just like the rest of the world. We're not perfect, but we are always engaging in this metacognition of thinking about our thinking. And that is what is mindfulness. And that is what is contemplative practice, which is now part of contemporary educational practices. So here's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about, very briefly, we only have 45 minutes, the history and foundation of mindfulness. I'm going to focus on its use in the United States and the Western part of the world. We're going to talk about the high levels of inequity found in K-12 schools. And again, we only have 45 minutes, so we don't have enough time to really address all of these things. I will discuss the importance of social emotional learning as a tool for yourself, for your students, for the engagement within your classroom, your building, your administration, your school district, your community, right? So it's something that benefits all stakeholders. And that's why I want to remind you that if you're teaching at the college level, teaching people who want to be classroom teachers, or teaching at the secondary or K-12 level, that all of this can be useful to everybody who teaches or engages with other people. I want to talk with you about how mindfulness can be used as a tool to promote equity. And maybe it seems very abstract, right? This concept of equity and what can I do? And I'm going to suggest that all of these changes begin with us individually. And really my goal has always been rooted within the capabilities approach. So I'm talking about Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, and this idea that if we are truly equitable with those who live within our communities and our country, we're not looking at the wealth of the economics of that country, but rather we're looking at the abilities of all members of that community to flourish. And flourishing means that you have opportunities to do what you would like to do and be successful with those opportunities in your lifetime. And flourishing is where we improve our capabilities and we actually improve the lives of the people in the country. Because when we look at the GDP of some of these countries, including the United States, it looks like we're doing really well. But when we look at the distribution of wealth and we look at the inequities built into our country, we recognize that a lot of communities have been shut out. Again, we only have 45 minutes. And then I want to talk with you about the different ways that I've used mindfulness. So I've done a lot of classroom action research. I also have been working with a doctoral student working on her EDD through another university called Antioch, and she's using mindfulness in an inclusion classroom, and she has contributed a short 1-minute video to tell you about her experience. I also have used this for teacher prep programs, talking about why being a mindful teacher is really beneficial to you and your students. So these are some of the things I'm going to touch on today. Please, again, interrupt me if you have any questions about anything. I'm not just saying that, I truly mean it. All right, so let's talk about inequity. We have to recognize that inequity is a part of our education due to the fact that inequity is built into our system. And we can see that when we think about things like the curriculum, when we think about the textbooks, when we think about the narratives, when we think about the lens in which we teach. We know that the dominant culture, the dominant groups are the ones that have the voice and the ones that hold the power and the ones whose perspectives we're often being taught, right? We're not necessarily hearing about the minority or the oppressed position. And if you're keeping track of politics around the country, you know that Florida has already started to shut down things because of the fear that people of the dominant race and culture might feel offended, feel bad about themselves, feel guilty. And so the governor of this state is working very hard to promote this inequity in the state. And my concern, of course, is that this can be, like a lot of other things, it will have the effect of shifting many other states to start moving in that direction to where we see a lot of censorship and we see a lot of people who are excluded rather than included. So most adults have spent their lives in schools, right? And we know that a lot of what we were taught, if we don't reflect on it, really is about the dominant culture. The language, the curriculum, the culture of schools are developed both directly and indirectly due to the direction of the dominant culture. So it can be intentional, and even someone as myself, being originally from India, being the only person that is not white in my school district, even I have to work really hard to be more inclusive and more equitable within the curriculum and the stories and the way that I speak to my students, because it is always challenging to do something outside of the dominant culture because it's rarely supported, right? Brief history on mindfulness and how it can be used in schools. So what is mindfulness? And this word gets used a lot now. If you turn on the television, you'll see advertisement about being mindful. When you do job searches and you look for a job that includes mindfulness, you might discover that being an HR person could be someone who's mindful. So what does it even mean? Mindfulness is really just an awareness. It is metacognitive in the sense that you are aware of your thinking. Being aware of how you think and feel and sense is mindfulness. The trick to mindfulness is to have this awareness and then just have the awareness, meaning no judgment. That's the hard part. So in this country, we would suggest that the pioneer of mindfulness becoming something that we see in households today really is about Jon Kabat-Zinn. Jon Kabat-Zinn created a program you might be familiar with called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. And he really started this. He's a scientist. He's out of Massachusetts. And he started this to help people overcome illnesses and barriers to getting healthy again, and discovered that this was so applicable to everybody that this is now an 8-week program that you can do even online. So a lot of schools have jumped on this bandwagon. The last time I was teaching at a K through 12 school, I was at a middle school, and they did a whole thing about bringing in growth mindset and bringing in mindfulness and social emotional learning, right? So we know that mindfulness can be used to help students increase their focus. It can be used to help teachers be more equitable as they're engaging with their students. And oftentimes it is built into the curriculum in some form of character development or some form of social emotional learning programs. Within the within the educational setting, we want to categorize where does mindfulness really fit in. So mindfulness fits into a form of educational classification called contemporary education. It is a form of contemplative education, meaning I'm thinking about something deeply. So I have a discussion prompt here. Have you practiced anything like this in your own classrooms where you pause your lesson and you ask students to think about it? Think about what they just heard, think about what they think about what they just heard, and think about why did you have those feelings that you thought about what you thought about when you heard it or felt it, right? So you ask yourself, why do I feel this way? What ideas came up when I felt this way? What do I feel? What do I think? What do I want or desire? What am I pushing away? As in, I can't accept it, so I'm rejecting it. All of these awarenesses and our reactions to how we think and feel and sense anything, any thought, is a form of metacognition. The thinking about the thinking, right? Meta in between. Awareness without judgment is what is mindfulness. So you can have thoughts about things. Like I just gave an exam this morning, and I always have my students doing breathing exercises before they begin their exam, simply because we know the science behind it says that it helps to tone our vagal nerve, it helps to increase resiliency, it reduces stress, it reduces test anxiety. What comes up? Why would somebody need this? Because a lot of times people have very undesirable feelings, sensations, and thoughts when someone tells them they're going to have a test. I usually don't even call them tests. I call them concept checks. Let's check to see what you've learned. I try never to give high stake tests. And the reason for that is that I know that if someone feels a lot of stress or have thoughts about these that are not positive, then their prefrontal cortex is not doing the work. And I have no evidence that they're learning what they should be learning or that they know anything because they can't express it during the exam, right? They're in that fight, flight, fawn, or freeze mode, which is our reptilian brain. And this is what mindfulness can do, is get us out of that. And it has to be something that we intentionally work on. Otherwise, we just become reactive. And this is where the no judgment part comes in, because we become aware, oh, in the third grade, I had a math teacher that scared me. And I find that every time someone says I'm going to have a math test, I blank out. We have an awareness. We don't think about our fear of the math test or our math teacher, but instead we recognize that we have that fear. That's the awareness with no judgment. Questions, comments, anyone would like to add to this discussion with any of these prompts? Have you done this?
In the chat, you can see Marjane Kadem Gilpatrick says, I used to do this type of learning experience with my teacher candidates when I taught cultural diversity in education, lots of self-reflection. Kate Jordahl, as a photography and art professor, I use these questions and ideas, but would like to use these practices more intentionally. And Primrose Igonor says, unfortunately, I have to attend another meeting. But also, indeed, self-reflection is key when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there are some comments in the chat. And if folks would like to use their voice instead of their fingers, you're welcome to raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I agree. These are helpful and they certainly are used with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it has to be taught. And you will discover that when you meet my grad student, because one of the things that she said to me was some of what I'm teaching her is so simple. She's like, why aren't we being taught this? Why can't we know about this as part of our common culture so that we can use these tools to benefit the equity available to students in the classroom? right? And so we have to have a shift. And of course, it starts with things like attending a conference and understanding that it can be used that way, right? When I'm a yoga teacher, I often look at who's in my room. And I've also done research. My dissertation research is rooted in yoga and mindfulness. And what I've discovered is that a lot of times, if you don't use directed language specifically for targeted groups, a lot of times these groups think, well, this isn't for me. You know, this isn't about me. This isn't what my community, my ethnicity, my class, my race, my gender does. We don't practice yoga. They're talking about someone else, right? So we have to really think about how do we frame the way that we speak to increase the equity of who shows up and who participates. And oftentimes it's going to be the people that need it the most, that don't see themselves there because it's not something that they would do, right? An example on the East Coast that's still very true is that a lot of guys don't think yoga is for them, right? They have a misunderstanding of what it's about. And because of all of the issues that we have surrounding gender and patriarchy and so on, you know, a lot of people think it's just not for them. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not something that they see applying in their lives. And yet these are the same people that if they knew that this could be for them, then this is something that they would probably employ because it is beneficial to anybody, right? So thank you for the comments. I'm going to move on to the, my fear has come. There it goes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on. And I already gave you that little classification, which is that contemporary education is defined as teaching that connects what is learned in school to real life situations, meaning how is it identifiable within the lives of that student that you're reaching, right? And a lot of this happens with storytelling. And again, the way, what I was just saying, which is using words that reframe the idea and makes connections with the audience that you're speaking with. We know that the benefit of this is that it makes learning more meaningful to a student. And if we know that it's more meaningful to the student, they're more likely to retain that information. And the second bonus as an educator is that it also increases or enhances our motivation to want to learn more. And that's a terrific thing when a student shows up and says, hey, this is about me, this is important to me, and I want to know more. Within contemporary education, we have many forms, and one of which is called contemplative. And I want to share with you the fact that this seems like we've talked about this before, and the answer is we have. We're actually using a new approach to an ancient practice. And there is some misinformation on this as well. Sometimes people believe that we are actually practicing that something that might be based in a religion or based in a philosophy that does not transgress the way that maybe the community wants to have an attention to, right? And the answer is that's just not the case at all. That's just a misunderstanding. Very much like when California was dealing with the fact that they were being challenged even a decade ago about bringing yoga into the schools. There was this fear that somehow this is a religious practice or some kind of a brainwashing practice, when actually it wasn't. Yoga is really about the containment and the release of a breath with movement, right? So it is an ancient practice. People have been contemplative as long as humans could think about anything. And we've seen this before, and we often see it on the other side of the globe. However, it is not rooted in any kind of religion or any kind of bias. Rather, it is rooted in this idea that we all have the ability to think, but we need to suspend judgment so that we can progress with our thinking instead of inhibiting us from moving forward because we have a thought about it that prevents us from liking it or wanting it in our lives, right? So it allows students to become more aware of themselves, which in turn assists them in their learning. And it helps to release some of those barriers or resistance that we learned about in exposure to these types of things. For example, in my dissertation work, 100% of the high school students that engaged in what I call mindful yoga, which is thinking about your thinking while doing or after doing a yoga practice, 100% of the students said it made them feel better. They said that it released their stress. They said that it made them calmer. And I would suggest that the majority of these same students also said, I don't like it. I don't want to do it. It's not for me. And then the question was, how is it that something that makes you feel better is still being rejected by you? Right? And that became the next thought, is that why are we seeing this resistance? What is this really about? And it can be about so many things. It can be about not wanting to feel better when you always don't feel good, right? Could be about the idea that this isn't for me. I'm not somebody who does this kind of thing. And so we kind of have to expose students to this in a way that's meaningful to them. And that has to do with how we talk about it. What I can tell you about it is that when we shut down these barriers and we ask students to think about their thinking without judgment by the teacher, by the class, by the student, we're actually promoting inclusivity and equity for that student. Okay, Kate has a question. I just saw that pop up. Yes, Kate.
I just thought, since you did invite other voices, how this parallels what I experience as someone who teaches creativity. How many people will walk in and say, I'm not creative, and they take a photo class because they need a class in that realm, and then find out they are. And then how many women walk in and say, but I can't do technology. And then they work through because they want to find it. And I think that same kind of nut can happen with mindfulness, where they find it in themselves and how it fits in their lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. I agree with you completely. And I think that when we have the thinking about our thinking, what we're doing is we're shutting out things that are possible for us because we're under the impression that we can't do it, right? And then again, without getting into all of it, because we don't have that time, a lot of times cultural biases, political biases, internal biases, you know, even from family background can stop people from thinking those things. I teach a course called Culturally Responsive Education. It's a 300 level course at SUNY Oswego, and I have my students, and they can't stand it when they are told to do this. They keep a creativity journal because they don't see themselves as creative, and they don't believe that this is useful to them at all. And then at the end, I have them write me a letter. Dear Dr. Mishra. And then I want them to express, how did you feel about it when you first heard about it? And just be honest, you know, your feelings are always correct. There's no right or wrong. And then tell me about the process that you went through. And how do you feel about it now that you've done it? And I would say 100% of students hated it, thought it was frivolous, time waster, and so on. And then they recognize things. Like I had one student who said that, you know, when I was younger, I loved to draw, and I just have gotten so busy. And part of her creativity was expressing herself with sketching. And she's like, it made me recognize how much I love it. And I need to find time for these things. And so it just warms your heart, right? Because you realize your students who have kind of censored themselves and biased themselves and shut themselves down, and there isn't much you can do to convince them otherwise. But if they think about it, all of a sudden they recognize, oh, I'm stopping myself based on whatever, but I can do this if I want to. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Dr. Mishra,
Okay.
just
Yes,
quick
go ahead.
question from the chat
Yeah.
from earlier. How can we help students who have peer pressure to chase the A grade rather than focusing on themselves and what they can learn?
That's a great question. I actually talk, so I'm one of these people, if physically I can embody what I think, you could see right through me, because I am all about transparency and grades. And I always tell my students, you know, we all want A's. We do, myself included. I was willing to drop out of a grad program because I got a B+ in a class. And I had to ask myself if I was good enough to continue, which is to share with you that no matter how old you are, no matter how smart you are, no matter how accomplished you are, we kind of root back to the demands that were placed on us, either by ourselves or a family or whatever. And we just keep hanging on to them. So I talk with them about that. You know, grades are important because, not because they're important, but because it's transactional, right? I have to give you a grade to show evidence that you did some work. And it's funny that you're bringing that up, because I actually did a whole thing with another program where I talk about the term compassionate grader. And that's what I call myself. So I explain to my students, I'm a compassionate grader. And what I mean by that is that I have a rubric, so I don't bring bias into it. But the rubric is designed so that if the effort is made in that direction, it doesn't matter how you feel or what your thoughts are or what the outcome is. And I think that's easier in something that's not science or math, right? Where you have either right answers or wrong answers. but I move in that direction. So I think that what I would ask a student, for example, in a math class, who wants an A and is struggling because that's all that matters to them, is I would want them to do some breathing exercises with me, which I do with my students one-on-one. They can set up a time to meet with me. And I say to them, look, I'm not a therapist, and please don't give me any answers that you don't want to. I'm not trying to pry into your life. I said, but I'm going to ask you some questions, and it's going to feel like a therapy session, but it's not. Here's what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you to think about the first time that you thought getting an A was important. You got to really go back. And then you're going to have to ask yourself, why was it important? Why did this matter so much? And some students discover that it was that their families wanted them to get A's because they didn't do well in school, or because they did do so well in school, meaning they're not allowed to be an individual. They can't just exist and go through their own experiences without it being something that the family is promoting, or the family expects them to be kind of like a clone of who they are. And that's neither right or wrong, right? No judgment, but to have that awareness and to recognize that the reason why I feel compelled to only do things that I know I can be successful in, because I'll get that A, is really rooted in this idea that that's what I have to be, and that you will survive if you don't get an A. And you might feel disappointed, and that's okay. Ask yourself why that mattered so much and acknowledge it. That's it. We all have stuff. We just acknowledge it. And that's why I share with them, you know, I'm in grad school, I got a B+. Of course, all I want are A's. Who doesn't? And I had a moment where I thought, maybe I'm not good enough. What's that about, right? This idea that the A is the measuring stick, and anyone that gets less than an A isn't good enough. That's a problem, right? And so that's it. And then I also remind them that grades are just that. They're just transactional. It's a snapshot in that moment. Like you're taking an exam. In that moment, here is what I was able to retrieve from my brain. Doesn't mean that's all I know, but in this moment, that is what I got. And so we have to learn to love ourselves and accept ourselves, even when we don't measure up to whatever measurement we think we need to be measuring up to. And that's a tough one. And it's a lifelong process, which is why we say yoga is a practice. Some days are better than others. It's a practice. There's no beginning, there's no end. You just keep doing. It's like life is that journey, right? And I know that seems like an ambiguous answer, but what I'm trying to get you to understand is that the problem isn't that the student doesn't get an A, or that the student wants an A. The problem is, why is it that the student is fixed or focused on this? And for me, I just have really honest conversations with my students about it. Because for some of them, they've never thought about it. They've never thought about why. And then they start to think about it and they realize it's okay. You know, I don't have to be perfect. Okay, I hope that answered it.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, thank you. How can awareness increase the equity of a classroom? It was my question. And why does it even matter? I will suggest to you that when we are aware, because we all have implicit biases, all of us, when we become aware, for example, of an implicit bias that we might have, it allows us to move in a different direction. Meaning, I'm aware I have that bias, but I'm not going to act on that bias. Instead, I'm going to open up and I'm going to move in a different direction and see what happens, building new experiences. And that's why it matters, because I can tell you from being in a K-12 school, students are tracked. You have the smart kids, you've got the slow group, the inclusion group, and we tend to segregate them. And we have expectations for them and a lot of stereotypes about different groups of people and their expectations, right? But if we can become more aware that we're having this expectation that's not real, it increases equity. An example of that might be, someone brought this up, females thinking they can't do something because they're a female, right? And we have to understand that the limitation is due to these implicit biases that we're all acting out on. But what if none of this is true, right? And that's kind of what I tell my students when I teach a course at SUNY Oswego. It's a 300 level course called Teaching for Social Justice. I always say, look, we make all this stuff up. We create the structures that put people into these boxes. And then we tell them, this is how you need to be. And this is what people will think about you when you're in these boxes. But what if none of this is true? What if we got rid of all these boxes? Then what would happen? And how would that increase equity? It's a lot to think about, and we have to move in that direction. And I'd like to think we are moving in that direction when we have conferences about equity. It truly increases the perception of the teacher to be more open and more equitable. It increases the perception of the student for themselves to recognize that the barriers and limitations aren't really there. And it can follow through, right, into the classroom, into the community. And it can be a really great thing to recognize this, that we are capable, if we have the right guidance and we have the right mindset, to promote the possibility that we can do something. And that's what we mean by increasing equity. Lots of stuff here. I'm not going to read it to you, but I am going to talk with you about it. And I apologize, because I would be very upset if somebody did a PowerPoint with all these words on it. So I'm sorry for that. These are my thoughts, and I would love to hear your thoughts. I think that inequity is built into our school system based on two major factors. The first one is inequity in funding of the schools, and the second one is in that intrinsic bias that I was just talking about. So I want to address inequity in funding. We know historically the United States tends to believe that schools are a place for equity and opportunity. That's why we send our kids to school, right? But because of the way schools are funded, there's no equity built into that. And mostly it's funded through states, right? And mostly that is funded through school taxes, which is mostly funded through property value. So if you live in a very affluent, wealthy area, the property taxes are higher and the school district is getting more money. If you live in a not affluent area where the property values are lower, then you're going to have less funding towards your school. And of course, there was a landmark case in 1973. It was San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. And Mr. Rodriguez argued that he didn't think it was fair that his children on one side of the street went to a different school and had a lot less stuff, you know, fewer options in curriculum, fewer resources. And then just on the other side, a whole different story. And the Supreme Court determined that the Constitution does not defend the way that we fund schools, and therefore this is fine. This is considered fair. Now, I don't think it's fair, and it is not protected under that 14th Amendment as a constitutional right. And we are seeing the inequities. And we know in the last decade, the federal government has been providing more money to states for schools. But then we see other things happening. For example, in New York State, public schools and private schools and charter schools and parochial or religious schools all get a piece of that. But the public schools are required to fulfill state mandates of what students are learning and whether or not they pass a state regents exam. And some of these other schools that are also getting the funding, they don't have to meet that benchmark. So that's an undue burden to the public school. But there's not much we can do about it except try to change it by talking about it and understanding how inequitable it really is. So that's my little bit about the funding piece, which is really a huge problem. And I would say the source of the problem. But if we go beneath the layer of the source and go into the root of the problem, it's really intrinsic bias. Because if we really believe that we're all the same and we all deserve the same, then Mr. Rodriguez shouldn't have to move to the other side of the street in order to get something better for his children. That's intrinsic bias. And intrinsic bias is constantly being fulfilled within our school system simply by the way that we run our schools. For example, 70% of school teachers are white, and being white's not a problem. But promoting only white heritage and only white history and white perspective can be a problem. White teachers are more likely to hold racial biases than non-white teachers. Now, that's a very bold statement. I have citations and references for everything I'm talking about so that you can go back and read it for yourself. I always tell my students, you can hear everything I say, but don't believe everything I say. Check it out for yourself. I promise you, I'm only going to give you the truth, but you don't know me. Check it out for yourself. Schools are microcosms of our larger community. Schools. And after high school, so many folks don't go back to school. They don't read a book. They don't continue to interact with people who are different from themselves in their little group. They don't. They stay in their little silos. And so then they get very biased information about the rest of the world, the rest of their community, and they become the ones that other the folks that are not in their circle. There are many school programs that aim to mitigate the problems of inequity. That is true. We are working hard. This is like the David and Goliath story. It is going to require individual work that eventually shifts the culture. And the way that the country is set up, where states have rights, we're seeing pushback from individual states that refuse to move in that direction. And that's something that really should make us pause and reflect on this. That's the intrinsic bias. Questions or comments?
One question in the chat, schools are K-12, or does this include colleges and universities as well?
So in this statistical data that are provided to you, it's K-12. K-12. I do not know the answer to the racial makeup of higher education. I do not know that off the top of my head. I am here addressing the formative years of K through 12. So I apologize for not having more information than that. But I will tell you that a lot of times people hold intrinsic biases about race, about ethnicity, about gender, about religions, and they don't move in a direction of releasing those biases because they are not engaging in academic or scholarly work or reading, or increasing the size of their own little community, because we tend to, as humans, associate ourselves with those who are like us and think like us. And this inherently is a problem in schools in general, right? Of course, at the college level, you know, we can teach things like critical race theory. We don't teach that in K through 12. So I can't answer that question.
I did find a link from the National Center for Educational Statistics about the instructors in the United States higher ed. So I'll just pop that in the chat.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's awesome. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So now that I've told you about the problem, you know, let's find some solutions. One of my background is in something called humane education, and they have a word that they use, which is become a solutionary, which is a silly word, but what it really means is we all can see the problems. Let's find some solutions. And sometimes we're looking for a solution, but we think it's not going to solve all the problems, so we don't move in that direction. And I'm suggesting that using mindfulness can move you even one step closer into that direction of equity. It's a good thing, right? So I am saying that we should aim to change ourselves. We should try to be what we aspire our students to be. When I'm teaching courses to train students to become K through 12 school teachers, I always call it Mishra's mantra. Be the student in this class that you hope to see in your own classroom. Now, I'm not saying that I have any kind of magic or karma effect on anybody, but if you're spending all your time not reading, not doing the work, not engaging, on your phone, making excuses, don't be surprised when it shows up in your classroom and you don't have the tools or understanding or even the compassion to understand why somebody else is not paying attention, right? And so we want to be equitable. So when I have students that do that, I just ask them, what's going on? What's happening? How can I help you with your time management? Right? It's not a judgment of you're a bad student or I don't like you or you're not listening to me. What's wrong with you? None of that. No, it's about what are we doing What are we expecting the outcome to be? And how do you think you're going to get there? So we have to change ourselves. We have to change the way we think about different groups of people, the expectations that we have on others. You know, I always talk about that generalized attribution error, which is this concept in psychology, which is that we tend to hold ourselves to a standard that's slightly different from others, meaning I can do it, but you can't. I always tell my students, parents do this really well. When a child says, well, why do I have to do this? And the parent says, because I said so. What you're showing them is that you have power over them and that you can do something, but you won't let your child do it. And I'm not saying it's applicable to everything, obviously, right? But the point I'm making is that we have to really go inward and look at ourselves and make those changes. Would we want somebody to be merciful with us? Would we want somebody to be compassionate with us? Would we want somebody to be kind and open and welcoming to us? Of course we would. Then we also have to share that with them, even if it's that one student that you're like never does their work and so on, right? So we have to pay attention and make those changes within ourselves. I think teaching metacognition within schools will make us all more aware of our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, and then eventually our patterns. And this is when we start to recognize where the problems are so that we can address them. It gives us insight into ourselves, and this will help us to become better at communicating. So when I teach a critical reasoning course as a philosophy course, I ask my students to always define terms before they have a conversation, because your idea of that term might be different from my idea of the meaning of that term. We have to come to an agreement so we can have a meaningful discourse. So understanding our biases, understanding thoughts that arise without judging them is a way to better connect with everybody else and to treat yourself and everybody else more equitably. Again, lots of stuff on here, so I'm not going to read it to you, but understand that I'm really trying to keep it all on the same page so we can have a long conversation about it. So I'm going to talk with you about mindfulness in schools, mindfulness within teacher education, and mindfulness in a classroom. All right. So mindfulness in schools is beneficial because it involves all stakeholders. So everybody, from the individual child to the classroom, to the administrators, to the school district, to that superintendent, that school board, and the community will benefit from this. If I jump to mindfulness in teacher education, why this is important is that how we train people who want to become school teachers really matters. Really matters. And we have to kind of address biases. We have to address traumas. We have to address all of those things and do something about settling our own bodies so that when we walk into a classroom, our students are getting the very best version of us that moment. That's very important. In order to be successful with both of these, the person who is looking to make these changes, they have to have their own authentic practice. You can't just talk about being mindful, you actually have to engage in it. The last part is mindfulness in the classroom. So I have a lot of evidence that I'm going to chat with you about. Middle school students, I did 1 year, I set up a reading corner with beanbags and plants and posters were always about minorities in science and technology. And I taught at a school that was 98% white. It was a Title I school, so most people were living in poverty. And I decided that instead of writing up referrals and sending students to the principal's office, I was going to do it a little differently. So I did the carrot approach, which is they earned the opportunity to do things like lay on a yoga mat, sit where they wanted to. We did breathing together, and students that needed a timeout would go sit in the reading corner where they would just aimlessly look around because they were upset about something, but they loved sitting in beanbags, and they started to notice, oh, there's a person of color who invented the traffic light. I didn't know that. And then they started to open their minds to these types of things. And what I discovered that year, and this was actually published in 2016, was that I had 0 referrals, 0, which is pretty extraordinary. because that rarely happens. And I decided I was going to focus on the good rather than focus on things that were going wrong. So it was an intention of mine. Also, I want to share with you my grad student. Her name is Gail Friend, and she has created a short video. Whoops. Uh-oh. Where is my short video? Oh, there it is. Okay. I got it out of order. I apologize. So this is my doctoral student, Gail. And she is working in an inclusion classroom, special ed, in the middle of the United States in Ohio. And she has just learned about something called super brain yoga, which was something that I taught her. And she decided that she was going to teach it to her students.
Dr. Mishra, before you play that,
Yes.
we're nearing the end of the session, so we want to make sure that folks know about the Padlet board for continuing this conversation. And then perhaps after you play it, we can have some closing thoughts and make sure people know how to transition to the next session. So
thank you so much.
But I think it would be wonderful to hear this voice as a way to bring home your ideas.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. I don't have a clock when I have a full screen. So, and like most teachers, I can just talk all day long.
Hi, my name is Gail Friend. I am a grad student obtaining my EDD in mindfulness and social emotional learning at Antioch University. I also work one-on-one with autistic students in a K through 12 school here in the Midwest for socially and emotionally challenged students. In the past month, I've been working with middle school students, teachers, occupational therapists, other staff, and social workers and counselors, teaching them super brain yoga. During this short period, we have witnessed incredible results in the classroom and outside of it. Some of the parents have told us. We've seen less negative behaviors. We've seen more positive and self-regulating skills. The occupational therapist and the counselors are reporting the same results, same outcomes. So in as little as 2 to 3 minutes a day, which is all it takes to do super brain yoga, we are building equity within our school and our classrooms by one student at a time and one staff at a time.
Thank you. Let me move the screen. Okay. I want to let you know that a lot of what we're talking about here, there are links to it in the PowerPoint. And I want to remind us of Horace Mann, who was a reformist in education. He believed that one of the goals of education is to be that great equalizer. So as we think about equity, we need to recognize that most of us go through schools and that this is a great opportunity where we can achieve equity. So thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this. If you have any questions or remarks, these are my references. And then my contact information. I'm always available to chat with you if you would like to ask or meet with me one-on-one.
Wonderful. And Natalia asked about the references slide. We are going to get the slides from Dr. Mishra and we'll put them in the conference website along with the session description. And you'll also find there the link to the Padlet where you can post questions. If you don't want to send them directly to the email, you can put it in the Padlet and share ideas with others about how you're incorporating mindfulness in your class or how you intend to based on what you've learned today. So we'd like to thank you, Dr. Mishra, for sharing these ideas with us. Definitely a way to address equity, and you've contributed to our conference so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I have sent you the PowerPoint. I really appreciate it. Have a great
Excellent.
rest of your day with your conference.
Thanks.